Hey everybody, welcome to the crew. I'm Joseph, also known as Sea Lord Jenda, and this is the history of the world. It's now 1600 BCE. In the last century, we saw Mesopotamia stagnant, Babylon in a state of slow decline and no dominant power in the region, and to the north, Hattusili I forged the Hittite Empire, which now hangs ominously over Mesopotamia. Egypt was mostly conquered by the 4th and 15th dynasty, the Hyksos, save for a remnant native 16th dynasty around Thebes in the south, which is now probably a mere vassal of the 15th dynasty. Civilization is beginning to develop in mainland Greece, but still has a long way to go. And in the east, while India remains mostly unorganized after the collapse of the Indus River Valley civilization a few centuries ago, China, or at least a fair-sized chunk of it along the Yellow River, has now been unified by the Shang Dynasty. So, Mesopotamia. The status quo in Mesopotamia is more or less this, and that status quo pretty much survived the last century within Mesopotamia proper, except for in the north, where the Hittite Empire, the Hatti, came to be more or less. Now, Mursili I currently rules the Hittites after his grandfather, and he's recently conquered much of Syria, down to Aleppo. In 1595, he leads his army down the Euphrates and into Mesopotamia, presumably lured by the fabled wealth and riches and so on of Babylon. At the time, perhaps the longest-range campaign ever conducted by a settled power. An epic strain on the resources of the still young Hittite Empire, still not as densely populated as Mesopotamia proper either. But Babylon, although wealthy, is suffering badly from corruption and generally ineffective government. We don't know any of the details, but we do know that the Hittites win whatever confrontation ensues. In 1595, Babylon is sacked, and the dynasty of Hammurabi is brought to an end. The statues of Marduk and his consort Zarpanitu, the primary gods of Babylon, are stolen, and the Hittites stand supreme in Mesopotamia. But they're 1,000 kilometers from home. The road networks of the era are, to be honest, very limited. They probably have to travel upriver back up the Euphrates. And in general, they have no chance of occupying Babylon for good. Instead, Mursili strikes a deal with the nomadic Kassites, who you can easily see. You can easily see just up to the north here. They have already been a threat to the established powers in the region for over a century, and they're now finally given some major land of their own, as a Kassite king, probably Agum II, though we're not sure, is raised to the throne of the ruined Babylon. It will take decades to rebuild, and they won't hold quite the power that their predecessors did for the time being, but with the Hittites on their way out, they are left in control. Unfortunately for Mursili, his great campaign has kept him away from the Hittite heartland for probably several years, and in his absence, the situation has spiraled out of control. The great conqueror returns home to celebrate his victory, and is immediately assassinated in a conspiracy led by his own brother-in-law and cupbearer, Hantili I, aided by his son-in-law, Zidanta. That's Hantili's son-in-law. Hantili takes the throne, has to fight just to hold on to Syria under pressure from another group of tribes to the southeast, the Hurrians, who live on the upper Tigris. And he does not achieve complete success. Drama continues within Hantili's own family within his lifetime. This is actually an image of Hantili's wife, Harapsili, by the way. We don't have an image of Hantili, unfortunately. So Zidanta, who helped murder Mursili in the first place, proves, shockingly, to be pretty ambitious, more than is really good for anyone. He may have made attempts to murder Hantili. Not entirely certain. If so, they are foiled, but it's not a successful reign for Hantili anyway. And when he dies in about 1560, after a reign of 30 years, may be murdered by Zidanta. I've seen some sources that claim it was, but it seems like the consensus is probably that he died of natural causes. But Zidanta then does definitely murder the legitimate heir, Picini, and other members of Hantili's family in order to ensure that Zidanta is able to take the throne and cement his own power. Now, Zidanta rules for 10 fairly uneventful years, only to be murdered in turn by his own son, Amuna. Fun times in the Hittite Empire. Knowledge of Amuna's reign is pretty fragmentary, but it appears that it was pretty much disastrous in earnest. He loses large swaths of territory to the Hurrians. Particularly, the Hurrians more or less unify into the powerful kingdom of Mitanni, which rules the upper Tigris, or more or less southeastern Anatolia, and as far west as Syria and into Anatolia proper along the Taurus River. The Hittites are more or less forced back to the far west, their homeland over here, and the old Hittite Empire is broken after hardly less than a century of real existence for the Hittite Old Empire. Now, Amuna still lasts 20 years on the throne despite his disastrous reign. And upon his death, the murders continue. Two of his sons, Titia and Hantili, are then promptly murdered to make way for another son, Huzziya I, who rules only 5 years and is then overthrown by his brother-in-law, Telepinu. There is another theory that Huzziya is just a usurper and Telepinu a blood son of Huzziya. Or of Amuna, I think that is actually, but this doesn't seem to be widely supported anyway. We probably assume Telepinu is a brother-in-law of Amuna's son, Huzziya, thus was married to one of Amuna's daughters. In any case, Telepinu I does manage to stabilize the Hittite kingdom somewhat, though he can't make any serious attempt to reclaim the short-lived empire, and basically has to cede everything east of the Taurus River. The Mitanni are left much the stronger power in Anatolia for the time being, and they're ruled by a pretty capable man by the name of Baratarna, although their records are not super clear in this period. Aside from stabilizing the kingdom, Telepinu's main concern is quite obvious. This is what's more or less what's left of the Hittite Empire at this point, incidentally. By Hurrian kingdoms, it's mostly just Mitanni, but they're not as unified as the Hittites. Which the Hittites aren't all that unified, given their many political murders, so you see the problem. And Telepinu's main concern, as I was saying, is quite obvious. Other than stabilizing as part of stabilizing the kingdom, he famously publishes an edict detailing the disasters which have befallen the kingdom since their moment of glory a century prior, and establishing a line of succession. Blood princes of any sort to inherit first, then son-in-laws if none exist. Only if none exist. And this edict is actually our source for almost all of these succession struggles inside the Hittite Empire, so kind of him to write it down for us. By 1500, Telepinu is approaching the end of his life, but he has held the Hittite core together and perhaps given them a chance to rise again in the future. Meanwhile, with Mitanni rising, the Hittites falling in the north, Mesopotamia proper is left to pick up the pieces after one dramatic year of Babylon being sacked, Mari being sacked, and the old power falling. Plus, Assyria more or less falls under Mitanni dominion as the Mitanni expand, not destroyed, but forced to pay tribute to them. Elam is one of the most significant powers at this point, based in the east. Assyria and the Sealand Dynasty still exist, but Assyria is now a vassal. Sealand probably gains a little bit of ground during the collapse of Babylon, old Hammurabi Babylon, but not a huge amount. There is now a new ruling dynasty in Babylon, the Kassites. They bring enough of their own military power to the table that they hold on to a good portion of Babylon's former territory, although at this point they're more of a regional power than a world power, such as it were. I mean, nobody is actually more than a regional power at this point due to the inability to project any power, but you get the idea. The Kassites are a second-tier power rather than a first-tier power like the Mitanni. Now, the exact orders of succession among kings are pretty irrelevant at this point. None of these kings achieved much of any great import. By the end of the century, the Kassites are well established and holding on in Babylon, but don't look like expanding or becoming a greater threat, probably under Burnaburiash I. The Assyrians are now a vassal state and ruled by Puzur-Ashur III. He has to rebuild the Temple of Ishtar and the walls of the city after the defeat by the Mitanni, so they're not any threat. In general, the Near East here is pretty shattered. Now, Egypt was already shattered when the century started. As we begin that century, most probably, Sakir-Har is ruling the Hyksos 15th dynasty from Avaris in the north. Bebionk is ruling the vassal native 16th dynasty from Thebes in the south. The north being Lower Egypt, the south being Upper Egypt, due to the flow of the Nile. Perhaps a decade into the century, dating is very uncertain for this whole period due to the lack of records and the chaotic situation in Egypt, Sakir-Har, or possibly actually Yanasi, whoever is sitting the 15th dynasty's throne, dies and is succeeded by Apepi, known in Greek as Apopis. Apepi is possibly a usurper, but either way he is able to secure his power, and he will rule for decades in the north of Egypt. The 16th dynasty is not lucky enough to be so stable. The Abydos dynasty is already dead by this time, incidentally. Bebionk dies in about 1588 and is succeeded by Sekemre Sedwaset, who rules for less than a year, and then by 5 more kings in 7 years who we don't even know their names for certain. Maybe Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Montemsaf, Mentuhotep VI, and Senusret IV, but these may actually have been from the earlier 13th dynasty. In any case, by about 1582, the 16th dynasty simply collapses. It is quickly succeeded by the 17th dynasty, though, a new native dynasty, also based in Thebes. Yay, 17. Surely 17 is a lucky number for Egypt. Some have actually argued that the 17th dynasty might have some Nubian ancestry or received assistance from Nubia. Obviously, Kush, or, well, the kingdom of Kerma in the south is quite powerful at this point, south of the First Cataract, and they pretty much rule everything up to the First Cataract of the Nile, where Egypt used to have this area. Pretty much all of this was on lock under the Middle Kingdom, but not anymore. But any alleged Nubian ancestry or assistance for the 17th dynasty is very unproven anyway, and should not be taken as fact. Definitely at this point, Kush or Kerma is deeply involved in Egyptian politics, though. Although they look very large on this map, to be clear, they are not anywhere near as densely populated as Egypt still, however. Now, the 17th dynasty initially maintains a peace with Hyksos, likely some sort of vassal, without the military capacity of the Hyksos. The first ruler of their dynasty is Rahotep. He focuses on restoring temples in Abydos and Koptos, which were probably destroyed by the Hyksos, which also does suggest that the Abydos dynasty's territory is under the 17th dynasty's control at this point. But Rahotep dies after a pretty short reign in 1576. He's succeeded by this fellow, Sobekemsaf I. Well, actually, there's some argument over that. There's even argument over over whether Rahotep is actually the first ruler of the 17th dynasty. But the most commonly accepted position is that this fellow, Sobekemsaf I, is the next to take the throne, and he rules for about 7 years, rebuilding several more temples, restoring some stability to the south, and generally doing all right for himself. He's very briefly followed by his son, Sobekemsaf II, but Sobekemsaf II's tomb ends up getting destroyed by robbers only a few hundred years later, which robs us of a lot of potential further information about this period. Nonetheless, Sobekemsaf II does seem to have had at least 2 sons, and his son Sekemrewepmat Intef-A, commonly known as Intef V, follows, reigns only 2 or 3 years before his own death, followed by his younger brother Intef VI, who rules for something like 6 years, and then also dies and is followed by Intef VII, relation unknown, who either dies within months or may have even been a son of Intef VI who predeceased him but was known as a co-regent. Either way, this brings us to about 1560, which sees Senaktenre Amos take the throne and die within about a year. His successor is this fellow, Sekenenre Tao. Keep in mind, through this whole sordid tale of succession in the 17th dynasty and 16th, it's been a Pepi on the throne in the north, securely, ruling the Hyksos. Now, Tao here rules only about 5 years, actually, but his reign sees the end of the truce between the 15th and the 17th dynasties. Legend says that this is because a Pepi ordered the removal of the 17th dynasty's hippopotamus pool because the noise kept him awake at night. This is obviously not literally true. If there's a grain of truth that I could speculate on, keeping hippopotami was very dangerous and expensive, thus a prestige thing for kings, or for pharaohs, that is. So perhaps a Pepi felt like his vassals keeping hippopotami was an insult of sorts, or was staking their claim to the throne. That's all my wild personal speculation, though. We don't have any solid information on that to go on, really. What we can say for certain is that fighting resumes between the 2 dynasties in earnest pretty early in Tao's reign. Now, content warning, the following slide does have the head of a mummy on it. If you don't want to see that, feel free to look away and I'll tell you when we leave it. So Tao's reign ends badly. He is most violently killed, with several fine axe blows to the head, along with at least 1 dagger wound and another dagger wound, I believe, in the throat. His body is embalmed quite hastily and crudely by the standards of the time before being buried as a mummy, which is part of why it ends up looking like this. It's usually said he dies either in battle or possibly to an assassin while sleeping. Some more recent evidence, such as deforming of the wrists, suggests he actually might have been captured, tied up, and executed by a Pepi and his army. Whichever scenario you prefer, it's very clear that Tao meets a grisly end at the hands of his enemies in about 1555 BCE. His enemies, we pretty much assume, meaning a Pepi in the 15th dynasty. But prior to his death, he had at least 3 consorts. His sisters, probably, Ahotep I, Amos-in-Hapi, and Sit-Jehuti, and by them has at least 11 children, including 1 son of age, Kamos. You can look back at the screen now if you're afraid of mummies. This is Kamos. He is of age to succeed Tao upon his death. There are also several younger sons, but we'll get to them later. Kamos sets about avenging his father with a will as soon as he takes the throne. He campaigns actually first to the south against Nubia, the kingdom of Kush, which suggests any friendship that might have once existed with the 17th dynasty is dead by now. And then, having apparently gotten them under control, he turns north in his 3rd year. Kamos campaigns up the Nile, adopts a sort of an island-hopping strategy. He seizes undefended towns and villages along the river, bypasses walled and defended cities, Presumably this means he had some kind of naval superiority on the Nile. And he moves quickly. He pushes the border quite a distance north in this manner, basically just leaving the cities behind him to be mopped up at his leisure. Now, the campaign is interrupted by the capture of a messenger from Apepi to the king of Kush asking for military aid, and probably also by simple logistics and the need to consolidate and mop those cities up. So, after the year's campaign, Kamose withdraws to Thebes to plan a new campaign against Kush, but the border is pushed significantly northwards, and it's the first major victory of the native dynasties against the Hyksos 15th dynasty for, well, the last century, more or less. Unfortunately for Kamose, he dies just a year or two later after all of maybe 5 years on the throne, probably while engaged in a second campaign against Kush. His successor is his younger brother, Ahmose I. Now, Ahmose is maybe... like my spelling? Ahmose is only about 10 years old, maybe 12 at the most, when he takes the throne in 1550. As a result, it's actually his mother, and Kamose's mother, Ahotep I, who takes power as regent and probably effectively rules Egypt for about a decade, in the course of which she's able to pretty ably consolidate Kamose's gains. The 17th dynasty does not wane in power under her. In fact, once Ahmose finally comes of age, he will find the kingdom very much ready for war. In the north, Apepi dies at last sometime during Ahmose I's regency after a reign of as much as 40 years and is succeeded by Kamudi, who is probably but not certainly his son. So, 10 or 15 years of relative peace pass, much of it during the regency of Ahmose I and a few years after he comes of age. Finally, Ahmose strikes. The 17th dynasty apparently just has a superiority over the Hyksos at this point. Ahmose is able to seize Memphis, then take Heliopolis at the mouth of the Nile Delta, and then descend upon the delta itself. Adopting clever strategy, he first takes the fortress of Charu on the eastern side of the delta, which guards the Horus Road leading from Egypt across the Sinai Desert into Canaan. Having thereby cut the Hyksos off from their homeland, he then besieges their capital of Avaris. He's repulsed 3 times, and interrupted once by a rebellion in his southern territories, but on the 4th attempt, Ahmose succeeds and takes Avaris. Kamudi, or at least some of his supporters, are able to flee to the fortress of Sharuhen in Canaan, near what's now Gaza, but Ahmose pursues and besieges them for 3 years before finally taking the fortress and presumably killing Kamudi. Although that's not, we have no idea what exactly Kamudi's fate was, but probably. With that, the Hyksos 15th dynasty is finally brought to an ignominious end, and Ahmose I reunites Egypt under his rule and the rule of a native dynasty. He is therefore counted as founder of the new kingdom of Egypt and of the 18th dynasty. Now, by blood, he was certainly also a member of the 17th dynasty, but the dynasties are dated more by events than by actual blood relations, to be honest. And always have been. Now, this map exaggerates considerably for this time period. In practice, Egypt controls more like not any of that, and not any of that yet. And probably not so far west into Libya either, but I don't know where exactly to draw the line. But Egypt is united. This is the core area of Egypt between these two lines, and it is finally reunited under the new kingdom. Moreover, Ahmose launches several further campaigns up into Canaan, not seeking conquest, but just to eliminate the Hyksos threat for good. And he does. We've found archaeological sites showing that many towns and cities in southern Canaan are simply laid waste and never rebuilt during the later years of Ahmose' reign. The reunified Egypt apparently just wastes no time wreaking a terrible vengeance upon its erstwhile invaders. Ahmose also does campaign to the south into Nubia to eliminate the threat from Kerma, and he basically crushes the immediate military threat from them and builds an Egyptian administrative center at Buhen just below the second cataract, therefore pushing Egypt's borders to here. And, well, after being in shambles, divided in two just a decade prior, Egypt's borders now already have reached pretty much their greatest extent, at least equal to their greatest extent in the Middle Kingdom, if not even further already. By about 1530, Ahmose has pretty much crushed all immediate military threats, and he embarks on a grand building program. He dedicates a tenth of all revenues to monumental construction in the name of the gods. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, Egypt flourishes once again. Gold and silver are extracted from Nubia, turquoise from the Zinai mines, cedar from Byblos, lapis lazuli is imported from Central Asia. He builds new temples of brick and limestone, constructs a palace on the ruins of the city of Avaris, and sponsors the development of early glassmaking. Most notably of all, he builds the first new pyramid seen in centuries at Abydos, the necropolis of the First Dynasty. Thebes is once again the capital of Egypt, and the religious center as well. The city's patron god Amun rises in prominence thanks to being credited for the victory in the campaign against the Hyksos, and Re's cult in Heliopolis more or less declines. The temple complex at Karnak near Thebes is reinvigorated. The city itself grows and becomes the center of a newly rebuilt civil service and bureaucracy. By the time Ahmose I dies in 1525, after 25 years on the throne, Egypt, for the first time in nearly 2 centuries, is united and is thriving. And frankly, with the Hittites by now in decline and Mesopotamia divided, the new kingdom is unquestionably the greatest power in the world. The possible exception being the Shang Dynasty far to the east, but China is probably just that little bit behind the Near East technologically and has not reached quite its later heights yet. Now Ahmose has at least 5 wives. His niece, Ahmose Sitkamose, daughter of Kamose, his brother, his half-sister, Ahmose Henutamehu, 2 minor wives, Kasmut and Thentapi, and most importantly, his full sister, Ahmose Nefertari. Ahmose Nefertari gives Ahmose at least 5, possibly 6 children, including at least 3 sons. Now, 2 of those sons, Siamun and Ahmose Ankh, predecease Ahmose, but one, Amenhotep I, lives to take the throne. Amenhotep I here is quite young when he succeeds still, and his mother Ahmose Nefertari is likely at least briefly regent for him, but he soon takes power in his own right, and will enjoy a long, mostly peaceful reign. He weds his sister, Ahmose Meritamun, and at least one other wife, Sitkamose, but ominously his only known son, Amenemhat, does not survive childhood. Amenhotep does campaign at least twice into Nubia, and expands Egyptian rule almost, if not quite all the way up to the third cataract here. And another campaign which is probably either into Libya or aimed at securing the western oases that exist in the desert west of the Nile. There is a slight possibility that he campaigns into Syria himself, but most likely Amenhotep pretty much leaves the Levant alone. He does expand and build extensively around the Temple of Karnak, and he makes a major change in Egyptian burial practices, by separating his mortuary temple, which is where he's worshipped and given offerings after his death, from his actual tomb. His temple is at Deir el-Bahri. The location of his original burial is still not actually certain. Now, Amenhotep rules for about 20 years and dies in about 1505 BCE. When he does, it is without a male heir of his body. Remarkably, however, thanks to well-laid succession plans, this does not cause a war, at least as far as we can tell. The throne instead falls to Thutmose I. Thutmose I is probably a noble or general of some sort who's given the honor of marrying Ahmose I's daughter, Mutnefret, which makes him a sort of cousin-in-law of Amenhotep. Ahmose having been Amenhotep's father, of course. And Thutmose is named as a successor well before Amenhotep's death and all the preparations laid in. There is also some possibility that Thutmose is a son of Amenhotep, maybe a bastard or via a minor wife, but this is the less likely case. Most likely he married into the family of the pharaohs and was chosen as successor due to, well, let's say talent, but ultimately would have been chosen as successor presumably because of the pharaoh liking him or his own ability to amass power. In any case, as mentioned, he is wed to Mutnefret and also to an Ahmose, who is probably a daughter of Amenhotep. Could be potentially a daughter of Amenhotep, but most likely is Thutmose's own sister, in true Egyptian royal tradition. Now, assuming it's true that Thutmose was adopted as heir, we don't really know where he originated or how he rose to that position. But he finds himself on the throne one way or another in about 1505. Most probably he's a warrior of some sort beforehand, as he does quickly prove an outstanding campaigner. In his first years on the throne, he campaigns far to the north, well into the Levant and Syria. He apparently faces only minor opposition, with the southern Levant, Canaan, essentially ruled mainly by local cities and tribes, which have already been much chastened by Ahmose I a couple of decades prior. And he reaches as far as the Euphrates itself into the territory of the Mitanni, although apparently no major battle is fought, and it's only 1 year's campaign season that he's there, most likely. But he brings back to Egypt tales of a river which flows upstream, an inverted water. The Euphrates, of course, the first river the Egyptians have ever seen that flows south instead of north. He returns to find Nubia in rebellion, and immediately heads south to crush that rebellion, slaying the Nubian king in battle, allegedly personally, probably not actually personally, but certainly the Nubian king falls in battle, and his corpse hung from the prow of Thutmose's ship as he returns down the Nile to Thebes. He builds a fort at Tombos near the third cataract of the Nile before departing, and on his way back, he has the canal around the first cataract, which was built by Sesostris III nearly 400 years ago now, dredged in order to support further campaigns into Nubia. And in his fourth year, he campaigns again into Nubia, this time as far as the fourth cataract and even further south. When he departs, he leaves behind a viceroy, the king's son of Kush, and a permanent garrison. In effect, Thutmose ends the independence of the kingdom of Kerma, or Kush, or Nubia, or whatever you want to call it. He ends it more or less for good, not for the foreseeable future, let's say, and more or less integrates it into the new kingdom of Egypt. With those campaigns concluded, he turns to a more peaceful remainder of his reign, but the warlike period takes us up to about 1500, so we'll talk about the second half of his reign in our next episode. China, meanwhile, is ruled throughout this century by the Shang Dynasty. This, of course, is not the entire region of what will one day be China, which includes, of course, everything that's dark on this map and is about I could hardly even guesstimate, probably 10 to 20 times the territory ruled by the Shang at this early date. But they do rule a large area along the Yellow River here, this being the Yellow River, and in some places stretch as far as the Yangtze River down here. I think this is the main course of the Yangtze, but anyway, the rest of China is still occupied by a great diversity of other peoples at this point. Many of them are not exactly settled agricultural peoples. Already, there are some of the eternal skirmishes with nomads from the north. Not a great threat to the Shang, but they happen, apparently. Overall, Chinese society is pretty much as advanced as that in the Fertile Crescent, perhaps marginally less. They have extensive bronze working, irrigation systems. They don't have chariots as yet, but those are mainly strictly a military advance. A little bit transport. They're not very practical for transporting goods, really. Cart will do just as well. Well, better, actually. In 1600, the emperor of the Shang is most likely Bu Bing, although dating is not certain. It might be Da Ding or Tai Jia. In any case, Bu Bing is eventually followed by Tai Geng, who rules for 25 fairly uneventful years, and then by Xiao Jia, who rules only 4 years, then his younger brother Yongji, who rules 12 years, and then by his brother Tai Wu, who apparently rules an improbable but not impossible if he took the throne as a young child due to the untimely deaths of his older brothers, 75 years, during which time Tai Wu apparently founds at least one city, Pugu, and treats with both the Rong to the west and the Yi to the east along the coast, both key members of what China will later call the Four Barbarians. Now, practically speaking, these are just other local civilizations which are a little bit behind the curve on the development of settled agriculture compared to the Shang, or what we would call civilization. But I shouldn't impart later Chinese behavior. This isn't. Several millennia in future, China will be somewhat unique in thinking of everyone outside its borders as barbarians, but it's actually not very special at all at this time. Pretty much a lot of the settled civilizations around tend to think of the non-settled peoples as barbarians at this point in time. Notably, I know for certain the Greeks definitely did, or at least did within a few hundred years after this. In any case, assuming the length of Tewu's reign is accurate, he still sits the throne of the Shang in about 1500, ruling a pretty powerful and prosperous chunk of what will be China. It's obvious at least some other powers do exist in the region, whether they're barbarians exactly or not. The relative lack of writing cannot tell us much about it. All the certain information we have about the Shang comes from oracle bones, which pretty much just only offer the equivalent of a king list, unfortunately, plus some semi-legendary information set down much later in time, so we have not that much hard information still from this period. There is some other news around the world as well. A new civilization seems to be rising on the southern shore of the Gulf of Mexico, not yet mature by any means, but already known for their excellent sculpture work, featuring these trademark oversized heads, and quickly developing a system of agriculture around the Coatzacoalcos River. It's still early days, but I have a feeling we'll be back to these people. We will call them the Olmecs. Oh, and on a side note, they have learned to tap the latex sap of the local rubber trees and mix it with a juiced local flower, probably a morning glory species, to create rubber. They actually initially use this for sacrifices, as the sap is seen as symbolic of semen and blood, and so they use it in offerings for fertility. But they've also discovered how to make the rubber into balls, and it turns out that those make great sport. As a result, what are probably the world's first significant ball games are, or within the next couple of centuries will be, flourishing around the Olmecs, with several different games featuring balls of varying size and rules. In other news, in Africa, a group of peoples called the Bantu, based in what's now Cameroon and Nigeria up here, have begun a major expansion and migration to the south and east into other parts of Africa, made possible by their development of a good system of agriculture somewhat ahead of the other peoples in Africa, and possibly by the ability to work iron into tools, although that's very unverified for this date, but has been part of the traditional story. What does hold them back is that they don't really have any noticeable state-level organization at this point. It's more a case of many competing tribes, and as their population grows and competes for resources, they migrate outwards, and in the process pretty much displace the various existing peoples of Central, Southern, and Eastern Africa. Notably, Eastern Africa is pretty much inhabited by Khoisan-speaking peoples, and Southern Africa by Kushite-speaking peoples, or Cushitic-speaking peoples. And both of these are pretty much slowly pushed into the fringes. Today, I believe that Khoisanite-speaking peoples pretty much only exist in... No, sorry, I got that backwards, actually. The Khoisanite peoples are in the south, the Cushitic-speaking peoples are in the east. The Khoisanite-speaking peoples exist only in small pockets in southern Africa today, and the Cushitic peoples have pretty much been relegated to the Ethiopia region. Now, I'm speaking of the very far future, of course. As you can kind of see from the dates on this map, this is not a quick process. It takes the Bantu-speaking peoples about 500 years or so, just from 1500 to reach the African Great Lakes region here, and several hundred after that to really fully displace the local peoples. And it takes them over 1,000 to really make it through the Congo jungles down to here, and perhaps as much as 1,500 or 2,000 before they really start taking over southern Africa in the savannas. Still, the Bantu expansion is now underway. I'm not going to update it on every single time, so this is happening. It will continue to happen for a millennia, more than a millennia even. Meanwhile, in Greece, to be fair, all of this happening is not so much history as archaeology, because none of these peoples have any significant writing systems for us to trace. In Greece, the mainland Mycenaean civilization is coming along nicely. The city of Mycenae itself is currently the dominant power among the various growing cities. At this point, they rival the power of the Minoans on Crete to their south. The Minoans were the first civilization in this area and have dominated the regions for centuries, but there is ultimately more land area on mainland Greece than there is on Crete, and it's likely that the Mycenaeans will soon surpass the Minoans, given another couple of centuries to develop, perhaps. Among other cities, the young towns of Thebes, and particularly of Athens, have lately been founded and look like pretty likely prospects, although, as I mentioned, it is Mycenae that is currently still the dominant city of the region. And that will bring us to 1500 BCE. It's about 3,500 years before the legendary present day, whatever that is. Egypt has been reunified. The new kingdom seems thus far quite eager to stretch its military muscle, with ominous consequences for the Levant and Syria. Whether that might bring it into conflict with the other powers to the north is yet to be seen. The lands to the north do remain divided at the moment, with the Hittites in decline after their brief, glorious period of success. The Mitanni, probably the strongest power now, but hardly a hegemon. Babylon, ruled by the Kassites, but not exerting much influence outside itself. Assyria, a Mitanni vassal. Elam, keeping to itself. Sealand, weak. Civilization is rising in Greece, as it continues to slowly expand, but most of Europe is only partially sedentary and settled still. The march of organized civilization is really not a quick one. India remains in a pretty depopulated and disorganized state after the fall of the Indus River Valley civilization, although it is slowly recovering. Shang China has enjoyed a pretty prosperous century by all accounts, although we just have very little information on any specific events there. The region is not so united as later imperial dynasties will claim, but as I said, that's hardly unique to China to think of everyone else as barbarian outsiders at this point. Practically every settled civilization does it, not least Greeks. Actually, the Egyptians as well, for certain, refer to everyone east of them very generically as Asiatics for the most part. So, in the future, now, can anyone unite Mesopotamia to stand against the expansionistic New Kingdom, or will the Egyptians run roughshod further north than ever before into the Tigris and Euphrates region? How far can Egypt star rise? How long will China last before it breaks for a while? Subscribe and tune in next time to find out.